Imagine standing in the Great Rift Valley, 300,000 years ago. The air is thick with moisture. Acacia trees dot a landscape that shifts between dense woodland and open grassland. In the distance, volcanic peaks rise against an endless sky. The earth beneath your feet is still warm from recent tectonic activity. This land is literally tearing itself apart, creating valleys, lakes, microclimates. And somewhere in this fractured, dynamic world, our species is being born, not gradually, not quietly, but through a convergence of pressures and opportunities that would never quite align this way anywhere else on Earth. 300,000 years ago, in this exact environment, Homo sapiens emerged, the first members of our species, your ancestors, mine, every human being who has ever lived. But here's the question that should keep you awake, at least for a few more minutes before this journey lulls you into sleep. Why here? Why only here? Because when you look at the world as it was hundreds of thousands of years ago, Africa wasn't the only continent with forests. It wasn't the only place with resources, with rivers, with abundant wildlife. Primates, our cousins, existed across multiple continents. Great apes roamed through what is now Europe and Asia. The building blocks of human evolution were scattered across the globe, yet humanity emerged from one place, one continent, Africa. Every language you've ever heard spoken, from Mandarin to Arabic to English to Swahili, traces back to Africa. Every civilization that has ever risen, from ancient Sumer to the Roman Empire to modern New York, was built by descendants of African migrants. Every technological innovation, every piece of art, every mathematical equation, every story ever told comes from minds that evolved in Africa. 7 billion people alive today, countless billions who came before, all of us, every single one, carrying Africa in our DNA, in our bones, in the very structure of our brains. This isn't hyperbole, this is genetic fact. But why? Other continents had everything necessary for human evolution. Asia had primates, sophisticated ones in fact. Europe had apes that walked upright. South America had its own evolutionary experiments playing out in isolation. The raw materials existed elsewhere. So, what made Africa different? What was it about this one continent, this one specific region, really, in East and South Africa, that became the crucible for humanity? The answer isn't simple. It never is with evolution. There was no single moment, no obvious advantage, no clear reason why our ancestors should have evolved here and nowhere else. But there was a combination, a perfect storm of geology, climate, and chance that created conditions found nowhere else on Earth. And over the next few hours, yes, hours, because we're going deep, perfect for drifting off, we're going to explore exactly what made Africa special. What transformed one branch of primates into creatures capable of language, art, abstract thought, and eventually space travel. This isn't just evolutionary history, this is your story. Your personal origin story goes back much further than your parents, your grandparents, even your distant ancestors from a few thousand years ago. It goes back millions of years through an unbroken chain of survivors, adapters, innovators, all of them African, at least at the start. Every time you stand upright, you're using a posture that evolved in Africa. Every time you speak, you're using cognitive abilities refined over hundreds of thousands of years on that continent. Every time you solve a problem, plan for the future, or imagine something that doesn't exist, you're deploying mental tools forged in the African environment. And the story of how those tools developed, how we went from small, tree-dwelling primates to the dominant species on the planet, is far more fascinating than most people realize. It begins 66 million years ago, in the aftermath of an asteroid impact that reset life on Earth. It moves through the rise of the first primates, tiny creatures that survived in the rubble of the dinosaur extinction. It follows these primates as they evolved, diversified, spread across continents, and then, surprisingly, as most of them went extinct everywhere except Africa. It chronicles the moment our ancestors stood upright, freeing their hands and changing their perspective on the world. It tracks the growth of the brain, the invention of tools, the discovery of fire, the development of language and culture. It reveals how, again and again, Africa's unique environment pushed our ancestors to adapt, to innovate, to become something more. And it explains why, when Homo sapiens finally left Africa around 70,000 years ago, we were so successful that we spread to every corner of the globe within a geological eye blink. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The journey is long. 66 million years is a time span almost impossible to grasp. For perspective, the entire history of recorded human civilization, from the first cities in Mesopotamia to today, spans only about 6,000 years. We're going back 11,000 times further than that. This is a story told in geological layers, in fossil records, in genetic markers that scientists can read like a history book written in DNA. It's a story of species that rose and fell, of evolutionary experiments that succeeded and failed, of environmental changes that opened doors for some creatures and closed them for others. And at the center of it all is Africa, not as a passive stage, but as an active participant in our evolution. The continent shaped us, its rift valleys, its climate swings, its mosaic of environments, forests here, grasslands there, lakes appearing and disappearing with the millennia, created pressure and opportunity in equal measure. Other continents had stability. Africa had dynamism. Other continents had uniform environments. Africa had diversity. Other continents selected for specialization. Africa selected for adaptability. And adaptability, it turns out, is the key to everything that makes us human. But here's where it gets even more interesting. And here's where the paradox deepens. Because humanity didn't just evolve in Africa. Higher primates, the anthropoids that would eventually give rise to apes and humans, actually evolved in Asia first, around 40 million years ago. That's right. Our deep ancestors originated somewhere else. They migrated to Africa. And then, the Asian lineages went extinct. Why did primates survive and flourish in Africa but disappear from their original Asian homeland? What made Africa a refuge when other continents became dead ends? The answer involves climate, competition, and the specific ways that Africa's geology created what scientists call evolutionary laboratories. Isolated pockets where populations could evolve independently, then reconnect and share innovations. It involves the formation of the East African Rift System, a massive geological feature that literally tore the continent apart, creating mountains, valleys, and lakes that fragmented forests and created the exact type of environment where versatility was rewarded. It involves global cooling cycles that turned much of Eurasia harsh and seasonal, while Africa's equatorial position maintained year-round warmth and multiple ecological zones. And it involves something else, something harder to quantify but equally important: luck. Evolutionary history is full of contingency. If the asteroid had struck Earth at a slightly different angle 66 million years ago, mammals might never have inherited the planet. If certain land bridges hadn't existed at certain times, primates might never have reached Africa. If the African climate had shifted just a bit differently, our ancestors might have gone extinct along with countless other species. But it didn't happen that way. The pieces fell into place. The continent tore apart at the right time. The climate shifted in the right ways. The right populations were in the right places when the right pressures emerged. And slowly, over millions of years, those pressures sculpted a lineage of primates into something unprecedented. First, they stood up. Then, they got smarter. Then, they started talking, planning, creating. And then, they inherited the Earth. This is the story we're about to explore. From the tiny, shrew-like creatures that survived the asteroid to the globe-spanning civilization you're part of today. From the first primates to climb trees, to the first humans, to leave footprints on the moon. It's a story of deep time, of forces so gradual they're invisible in a human lifetime, but overwhelming across millennia. It's a story told in bones and stones, in genetic sequences and geological strata. It's the story of why we evolved only in Africa. And the answer, I promise you, is more fascinating than you might imagine. So settle in, get comfortable. Let your mind drift back through the millions of years we're about to traverse. Because before we can understand why humanity emerged only in Africa, we need to understand how primates arrived there in the first place. And for that, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the day the dinosaurs died and the mammals inherited a broken world. 66 million years ago, the world ended. An asteroid 6 miles wide slammed into what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of 10 billion atomic bombs. The impact vaporized rock, ignited global firestorms, and shrouded the planet in darkness for months. When the dust finally settled, literally, 75% of all species on Earth had vanished. The age of dinosaurs was over. But here's the thing about catastrophe. It clears the stage. And in the rubble of that devastated world, something small was stirring. Picture the landscape just a few 100,000 years after impact. The forests are returning, slowly, cautiously. And scrambling through the undergrowth no bigger than a mouse is a creature called Purgatorius. Long snout, sharp little teeth, a bushy tail. To our eyes it would look unremarkable, perhaps like a tree shrew or a small rat. You might not even notice it. But you should, because this tiny survivor, this opportunistic scrambler in the post-apocalypse forest, is one of the earliest primates we know of. It's not your ancestor, exactly. Think of it more as a distant cousin to your ancestor. But it represents the beginning of our lineage. The primate story starts here, in the shadow of extinction, with creatures so small they could fit in the palm of your hand. For perspective, 66 million years separates us from Purgatorius. That's more than 300 times longer than the entire span of recorded human history. And yet, the thread connects. That's the dizzying scale we're working with. Now, these early primates, Purgatorius and its kin, weren't quite like modern primates yet. They were proto-primates, sometimes called plesiadapiforms. They had claws instead of nails. Their eyes faced sideways like most mammals. They were, in many ways, still figuring out what it meant to be a primate. But they had one crucial advantage. They were adapted to life in the trees. And in a world recovering from devastation, the trees were the future. Fast forward 10 million years. It's now 55 million years ago. The planet has warmed considerably. This is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a period of intense global heating. Tropical forests sprawl across much of the globe, even reaching the Arctic Circle. And in these lush canopies, true primates emerge. These creatures, early members of groups like the adapiforms and hominids, have something new. Forward-facing eyes, grasping hands with opposable thumbs, nails instead of claws, larger brains relative to body size. These aren't random changes. They're adaptations for a three-dimensional world. When you live in trees, depth perception becomes survival. When you need to grab branches, hands beat claws. When you're navigating complex environments, intelligence pays dividends. Imagine them, small, agile, leaping from branch to branch with precision. Eyes locked forward, judging distances. Hands wrapping around bark and fruit. These are the traits that would eventually give rise to monkeys, apes, and yes, us. But we're still 45 million years away from anything resembling a human. Patience. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. A twist that surprises most people when they first hear it. You'd assume, given that humans evolved in Africa, that our primate ancestors have always been African, that the entire story unfolds on one continent, a neat linear progression from ancient primate to modern human. But evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution is messy. It's full of detours and dead ends and migrations across continents. Around 40 million years ago, higher primates, what we call anthropoids, the group that includes monkeys, apes, and humans, first evolved not in Africa, but in Asia. Let that sink in for a moment. The lineage that would eventually produce you began not in the so-called cradle of humankind, but somewhere in the forests of what is now Myanmar, Thailand, or China. Fossil evidence of early anthropoids like Eosimias and Bauhinia shows up in Asian rock layers before they appear anywhere else. These were small, monkey-like creatures with more advanced features than earlier primates: fused frontal bones in the skull, a fully enclosed eye socket, more complex teeth for processing varied diets. So what happened? How did our ancestors get from Asia to Africa? The answer lies in geology and the slow dance of continents. Around 40 to 35 million years ago, during the Eocene and into the Oligocene, the Earth's land masses were arranged differently than today. The Tethys Sea, a vast ocean that once separated Africa from Eurasia, was gradually shrinking as tectonic plates shifted. At certain points, land bridges emerged, temporary connections, narrow corridors of habitat, and anthropoids crossed them. We don't know exactly when or how many times this happened. Fossil records from this period are frustratingly sparse. We're talking about small-bodied animals in tropical environments where fossilization is rare, but by around 38 to 35 million years ago, anthropoids show up in the African fossil record. They'd made the journey. They'd colonized a new continent. And here's the fascinating part. The Asian lineages that gave rise to these African immigrants, they went extinct. Every single higher primate lineage in Asia from this period eventually disappeared. The fossil record shows their decline and vanishing over millions of years. Meanwhile, in Africa, the immigrant populations thrived and diversified. Today, all Old World monkeys and apes, including us, trace their ancestry to those African populations, not to the original Asian ones. Why? Why did Asian primates fail while African ones flourished? The answer is almost certainly climate. The Earth was cooling. Global temperatures that had soared during the Eocene began a long, irregular descent. This affected different regions differently. Eurasia, at higher latitudes, became increasingly seasonal. Winters grew colder. Forests became less stable. Resources fluctuated dramatically with the seasons. For primates adapted to stable tropical environments, this was a slow-motion catastrophe. Africa, straddling the equator, remained relatively stable. Not unchanging, no environment ever is, but buffered from the worst extremes. The tropics persisted. Forests endured, even as they shifted and changed composition. For primates, it became a refuge, a haven, the place where evolutionary experimentation could continue without the harshness of seasonal extremes wiping out populations. But it wasn't just about staying warm. Africa offered something else: diversity. Picture the African continent 30 to 20 million years ago. It's a landscape of extraordinary variety. Dense rainforests in the Congo Basin, woodlands in the east, emerging grasslands in some regions, mountains, river valleys, coastal zones. This mosaic of habitats meant primates could specialize, could adapt to different niches, could experiment with different survival strategies. And when environments changed, as they always do, there were refugees nearby, other habitat types to escape into. In this crucible of diversity, African anthropoids radiated. They split into multiple lineages. One branch would become the Old World monkeys, species like baboons, macaques, colobus monkeys. Another branch, around 25 to 20 million years ago, would become the apes. The apes, our family, early apes like Proconsul, appear in the African fossil record around 23 million years ago. These weren't knuckle-walking gorillas or brachiating gibbons, not yet. They were more generalized. Quadrupedal, tailless, which distinguishes them from monkeys, larger-brained, more flexible in their locomotion and behavior. They lived in the forests of East Africa, moving through trees and on the ground, eating fruit and leaves, experimenting with different ways of being. And for millions of years, apes diversified across Africa and eventually back into Eurasia. By about 15 million years ago, ape species were spread across the Old World. Some, like Sevapithecus in Asia, would eventually give rise to orangutans. Others would go extinct, leaving no descendants. But the center of ape evolution, the engine of innovation, remained in Africa. Why? Again, we return to climate and geology. Around 15 million years ago, the world continued cooling. The Antarctic ice sheet expanded, ocean currents shifted, and most crucially for our story, Eurasia became increasingly hostile to tropical primates. Seasonal forests replaced evergreen ones. Open woodlands and grasslands expanded. For apes adapted to warm, stable forests, Europe and much of Asia became uninhabitable. Many lineages went extinct. A few, like orangutans, survived in Southeast Asian refugees. But the diversity collapsed. Africa, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation, and this transformation would create the conditions for something extraordinary. The East African Rift System began forming around 25 million years ago, but its effects intensified around 10 to 7 million years ago. This is one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, a place where the continental crust is literally tearing apart. As the rift spread, it created mountains, valleys, volcanoes, and lakes. It disrupted weather patterns. It created rain shadows, where one side of a mountain range received abundant rain while the other side dried out. What does this mean for evolution? It means microclimates. It means adjacent regions with radically different environments. It means populations of the same species could become isolated in different valleys, subjected to different pressures, evolving in different directions. The rift system became an evolutionary laboratory, a natural experiment in diversification, and it coincided with another crucial change: the fragmentation of forests. Between 10 and 7 million years ago, as the global climate continued its cooling trend and Africa's geography shifted, the continent's continuous forest cover began breaking apart. It didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, patchy, irregular. But over hundreds of thousands of years, the unbroken canopy gave way to a mosaic. Patches of dense forest, stretches of woodland, open grassland, riverine galleries of trees snaking through savanna. This mosaic environment is critical, absolutely critical. And here's why. In a continuous forest, there's one optimal strategy: be good at trees. Climb well, swing efficiently, eat leaves and fruit. If you're a great arboreal specialist, you win. But in a mosaic environment, the rules change. Sometimes you need to cross open ground to reach the next patch of trees. Sometimes the best food is on the ground, not in the canopy. Sometimes you need to spot predators across grassland. Sometimes you need to carry things, food, infants, tools, across distances where you can't use your hands for locomotion. A mosaic environment rewards versatility. It rewards experimentation. It rewards creatures that can do multiple things reasonably well rather than one thing perfectly. And this is the environment that apes in East Africa found themselves in between 10 and 7 million years ago. Not forced into it overnight, but gradually, generation by generation, living in landscapes where the trees were still there, but no longer everywhere. Where the ground was sometimes the fastest route. Where behavioral flexibility became survival. By 7 million years ago, the stage was set. Africa had become a unique place on Earth, equatorially positioned for climate stability, geologically active, creating diverse microclimates, environmentally complex, with forest grassland mosaics, home to populations of large-bodied apes who were already intelligent, already social, already adaptable. No other continent had this combination. Europe and Asia were too seasonal, too harsh, their ape populations dwindling toward extinction. South America had monkeys, but not apes. The two groups had split long before, and South America's evolutionary path went in different directions. Australia had no primates at all. Only Africa, only here, only now. And then something extraordinary happened. an innovation so significant, so revolutionary, that it would change the trajectory of life on Earth. An adaptation that seems simple, almost trivial, until you understand its implications. Our ancestors stood up. But why they stood up, and what it meant for everything that came after, is a story that deserves its own telling. Because bipedalism, walking on two legs, wasn't just a different way of moving. It was the beginning of becoming human. And it happened only here, in this specific time and place, under these specific pressures. The deep roots were in place. 66 million years of primate evolution, the survival of tiny creatures in a post-apocalyptic world, the development of grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, the migration from Asia to Africa, the extinction of alternatives, the refuge of the equator, the laboratory of the Rift Valley, the mosaic of the changing landscape, all of it converging, all of it necessary, and all of it pointing toward the next chapter of our story, the chapter where apes became something more. Picture this. 7 million years ago, somewhere in the forests of Central Africa, a creature moves through the canopy. It looks like an ape. It has the face of an ape. But when it climbs down from the branches and crosses a clearing to reach the next grove of trees, something extraordinary happens. It stands up. Not perfectly. Not the way you're standing or lying down right now, but upright enough, vertical enough, different enough that if you could travel back in time and watch this moment, you'd recognize something profound. This is the first whisper of humanity. This is where we truly begin. The creature I'm describing might have been Sahelanthropus chadensis. We know it from a single precious skull discovered in Chad in 2001. A find so significant that the team nicknamed it Tumai, which means hope of life in the local Goro language. The skull dates to roughly 7 million years ago, right around the time our lineage split from the ancestors of chimpanzees. And here's what makes Tumai remarkable: the position of the foramen magnum. Stay with me, this matters. The foramen magnum is the hole at the base of your skull where your spinal cord connects to your brain. In quadrupedal animals, creatures that walk on all fours, this hole sits toward the back of the skull. In bipedal animals, it sits directly underneath, balanced atop the spine like a bowling ball on a stick. Tumai's foramen magnum sits underneath, which means that 7 million years ago, in the forests and woodlands of what is now the Sahara Desert, yes, it was green then, something was already experimenting with standing upright. The revolution had begun, though it would take millions of years to perfect. But Sahelanthropus wasn't alone in this experiment. Around 6 million years ago, in the lush highlands of Kenya, another creature was taking its own steps toward bipedalism. We call it Orrorin tuganensis, and we know it from fragments, bits of thigh bone, pieces of arm, scattered teeth. But those thigh bone fragments tell a story. The femur, your thigh bone, is a remarkably informative bone. The angle at which it connects to your hip, the thickness of the cortical bone, the size and shape of the joint surfaces, all of these features reveal how an animal moved, and Orrorin's femur shows clear adaptations for bipedal walking. The angle is right, the structure is right. This creature walked upright through the forests of the Tugan Hills, perhaps climbing trees for safety and food, but increasingly comfortable on two legs. Why? What was driving this change? Hold that question. We'll return to it. Because first we need to meet one of the most fascinating creatures ever discovered. Her name is Ardi. In 1994, in the Afar region of Ethiopia, the same region that would yield so many hominin treasures, paleontologists discovered something extraordinary. A nearly complete skeleton of a hominin that lived 4.4 million years ago. They named the species Ardipithecus ramidus, and the individual specimen became known as Ardi. It took 15 years to fully excavate, prepare, and analyze Ardi's bones. 15 years of painstaking work, piecing together 125 fragments of a skeleton that had been crushed and scattered over millennia. And when the analysis was finally published in 2009, it revolutionized our understanding of early human evolution. Because Adi was a mosaic. She had feet that could grasp like an ape's, a divergent big toe perfect for gripping branches. But she also had a pelvis designed for bipedal walking. She had long arms for climbing, but she had legs that could support upright locomotion. She was part tree dweller, part ground walker, a creature caught between two worlds, or perhaps more accurately, a creature inhabiting both worlds with equal facility. Adi wasn't a chimp that learned to walk upright. She was something different, something uniquely adapted to a specific environment, a forest that was beginning to fragment, where trees still provided food and safety, but where the ability to move efficiently across open ground was becoming increasingly valuable. She represents a moment of transition, a threshold, and then, moving forward through time, we arrive at perhaps the most famous fossil human ever discovered. Lucy. On November 24, 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson was surveying a gully in the Afar region of Ethiopia when he spotted a fragment of arm bone poking from the sediment. What followed was one of the most significant discoveries in the history of human origins, a skeleton that was roughly 40% complete, belonging to a small female who died 3.2 million years ago. The team was listening to the Beatles that night, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing on repeat. The name stuck. Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, was definitively, unambiguously bipedal. Her pelvis was short and broad, perfectly designed for upright walking. Her leg bones angled inward, allowing her to walk with her feet under her center of gravity rather than waddling side to side. Her foot had lost the grasping big toe. It was aligned with the other toes, forming a rigid lever for pushing off the ground with each step. She still had long arms. She probably still climbed trees, perhaps to sleep safely at night, but she was built for walking. She was a biped, and she wasn't alone. Lucy belonged to a species that thrived across East Africa for nearly 1 million years. Australopithecus afarensis fossils have been found at multiple sites, representing dozens of individuals, revealing a successful, adaptable species that had fully committed to life on 2 legs. But the most emotionally powerful evidence of early bipedalism doesn't come from bones at all. It comes from footprints. In 1976, at a site called Laetoli in Tanzania, paleontologist Mary Leakey discovered something that still takes my breath away when I think about it. A trail of footprints, preserved in volcanic ash, left by 3 individuals walking across the landscape 3.6 million years ago. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the scene. A volcano erupts in the distance. Ash falls like snow across the savanna. It's damp from recent rain, the consistency of wet concrete. 3 individuals, possibly a family, possibly just traveling together, walk across this ash-covered ground. Their feet leave impressions. Then more rain falls, just enough to harden the ash without washing the prints away. Then more ash falls, sealing the prints. Then time, 3.6 million years of time, preserves this moment. Until Mary Leakey brushes away the overlying sediment and reveals them again. Those footprints are hauntingly human. The heel strikes first, then the weight rolls forward across the ball of the foot, then the toes push off. It's exactly how you walk. The arch is there. The big toe is aligned. These are the footprints of bipeds, of creatures whose bodies and movement patterns would be recognizable to you, even though their faces and brains would still seem ape-like. There's something deeply moving about those prints. They're not fossils in the traditional sense, not bones turned to stone, not artifacts shaped by hands. They're traces of behavior, preserved by chance, offering us a window into a single moment of ancient life. 3 individuals, walking together across the ash-covered plain. Where were they going? What were they thinking, if thinking is even the right word? Were they afraid of the erupting volcano? Were they fleeing? Or simply travelling, as they did every day, across their home range? We'll never know. But they walked upright. That much is certain. And that brings us to the question that's been building since the beginning of this section. Why? Why did our ancestors stand up? What evolutionary pressure or advantage drove this radical transformation in body plan and locomotion? Here's the thing. There's no single answer. Evolution rarely works through single, simple pressures. It's not a story of one day an ape stood up, found it advantageous, and passed that trait to its offspring. It's messier than that. More complex. More fascinating. Bipedalism likely emerged through a constellation of factors, each contributing some selective advantage, each reinforcing the others over millions of years. Let's start with energy efficiency. It might seem counterintuitive. Standing and walking on two legs looks precarious compared to the stable four-point contact of a quadruped, but biomechanical studies have shown something surprising. Over long distances, bipedal walking is significantly more energy efficient than knuckle walking. The way chimpanzees and gorillas move when they're on the ground. Your legs are long, your stride is efficient, your center of gravity is positioned such that each step requires relatively little muscular effort to maintain forward momentum. A chimpanzee, by contrast, has to support much of its weight on its arms with each step, engaging more muscles, burning more calories. In an environment where food was becoming patchier, where you might need to travel farther between fruit trees or foraging sites, this efficiency mattered. It meant you could cover more ground with the same energy budget. You could expand your range. You could survive in habitats where food was more dispersed. Then there's thermoregulation. Stand up right now, or imagine standing up if you're drifting towards sleep. Notice how much of your body is directly exposed to sunlight. Just your head and shoulders. Now imagine you're on all fours. Suddenly your entire back is a solar panel, absorbing heat. In the increasingly open environments of East Africa, where forests were fragmenting into woodlands and savannas, heat management became crucial. An upright posture minimizes the surface area exposed to the overhead sun. It also elevates your body into higher air currents, allowing better convective cooling. And when you're upright, more of your skin is available for evaporative cooling through sweating, which, incidentally, we're exceptionally good at compared to other primates. Bipedalism, in other words, is a thermal adaptation. It allowed our ancestors to remain active during the heat of the day when other animals were seeking shade. It gave them access to temporal niches, times of day, that competitors couldn't exploit. But perhaps the most intuitively compelling explanation is the carrying hypothesis. Free your hands. That's what bipedalism does, fundamentally. It liberates your upper limbs from the constraints of locomotion. And once your hands are free, you can carry things. Food, tools, infants. In a fragmented landscape, where resources are scattered and unpredictable, the ability to carry food from where you find it to a safer location, or to share it with offspring or mates, becomes enormously valuable. The ability to carry tools, even simple ones, extends your foraging efficiency. The ability to carry an infant means the infant doesn't have to cling to your fur, doesn't have to be strong enough to hold on during long treks, which means infants can be born less developed, which means they can have larger brains relative to the size of the birth canal. See how these factors cascade. One adaptation enables another, which enables another. There's also a social component. When you stand upright, you're taller. You can see farther, over tall grass, across the savanna. You can spot predators earlier. You can survey the landscape for resources. And you can display to rivals or potential mates. Height is impressive. Height is intimidating. Height signals fitness. In the social dynamics of early hominins, the ability to stand tall might have carried significant advantages in mate selection and status competition. So which explanation is correct? All of them. None of them exclusively. This is the mosaic environment theory. Bipedalism didn't evolve for one reason, but as a response to a complex, changing environment that rewarded versatility. The forests of Africa were fragmenting due to cooling, drying climatic trends. The continuous canopy was breaking into patches. Woodland here, open grassland there, riverine forest along watercourses. To survive in this mosaic, our ancestors needed to be flexible. Tree climbing ability remained useful, but so did efficient ground travel. The ability to exploit both arboreal and terrestrial resources, to move between patches, to adapt to variability, that's what bipedalism offered. It was a bet on flexibility in the face of unpredictability, and it paid off. But here's a crucial question. Why only in Africa? If bipedalism offered all these advantages, why didn't apes in Asia or Europe evolve the same solution? The answer lies in that specific combination of factors we keep returning to: Africa's unique environmental context. Other continents had forests, other continents had apes, but they didn't have the East African rift system, with its microclimates and geological dynamism. They didn't have the same pattern of forest fragmentation, not too fast, not too slow, but at a pace that allowed populations to adapt rather than simply going extinct. They didn't have the stable equatorial refuge that allowed populations to persist through climatic fluctuations while still experiencing enough pressure to drive innovation. Europe and Asia were experiencing more dramatic climate swings. Forests expanded and contracted. Ape populations there either retreated with the forests, adapted to fully terrestrial life in different ways, or went extinct. But they didn't have the evolutionary runway that Africa provided, the combination of pressure and refuge, challenge and stability that fostered the gradual emergence of bipedalism. Africa was, once again, the perfect laboratory. And the Australopithecines, the diverse group of bipedal apes that flourished between roughly 4 and 2 million years ago, were the proof of concept. Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, is the most famous, but it was far from alone. There was Australopithecus annamensis, an earlier species from Kenya and Ethiopia. Australopithecus africanus from South Africa, with its slightly more gracile build. Australopithecus garhi, possibly the first tool user. And later, more robust forms, Paranthropus, with massive jaws and teeth adapted for processing tough vegetation. These species were all experimenting with the same basic body plan: upright walking, relatively small brains, ape-like faces. They occupied different ecological niches, ate different foods, used slightly different strategies. Some thrived in woodlands, others in more open environments. Some were generalists, others specialists. It was a remarkable adaptive radiation, all built on the foundation of bipedalism. But, and this is important, these were not yet humans in any sense we'd recognize cognitively. Their brains were still small, roughly 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, about the size of a chimpanzee's brain, and less than a third the size of yours. They were smart, certainly. They were social. They had complex behaviors. But they weren't making elaborate tools. They weren't using language. They weren't creating art or burying their dead or contemplating the stars. They were bipedal apes. Successful, adaptable bipedal apes, but apes nonetheless. Still, something was beginning. By around 3.3 million years ago, someone, we're not sure which species, was making stone tools. Simple tools, just rocks deliberately flaked to create a sharp edge, but tools nonetheless. The oldest known stone tools come from a site called Lomekwi in Kenya, predating any known member of the genus Homo. An Australopithecine made those tools. An ape-brained, upright walking creature looked at a rock and saw potential, saw utility, picked up another rock and struck it at just the right angle to produce a cutting edge. That moment, that cognitive leap, was the seed of everything that followed. Bipedalism freed the hands. Free hands enabled tool use. Tool use created selective pressure for better hand-eye coordination, for planning, for spatial reasoning, which created pressure for larger brains, which enabled more complex tool use, which created more pressure for larger brains. It's a feedback loop, a cascade, an evolutionary engine. Bipedalism was the foundation, the platform, the prerequisite for everything that made us human. But the revolution itself, the explosion of brain size, the emergence of language, the conquest of the planet. That was still to come. That's the next chapter of the story. For now, as you settle deeper into rest, picture those footprints at Laetoli. 3 individuals walking upright across the ash-covered plain. Their journey has ended, but ours was just beginning. They stood up, and in standing, they set in motion a transformation that would eventually lead to you, to cities and symphonies, to agriculture and space exploration, to language and love and everything that makes us human. But first they had to stand, and they did, in Africa, only in Africa, because only Africa had the precise conditions, the geological dynamism, the climatic pressure, the environmental mosaic, the stable refuge, to nurture this improbable experiment, the experiment that became us. Section 3. The Rise of Homo, Brains, Tools and Wanderers, 2 Ma to 300K. Bipedalism was the first revolution, but walking upright, as transformative as it was, didn't make us human. Not yet. The Australopithecines, Lucy and her relatives, were still small-brained, still limited in their cognitive reach. They could walk across the African landscape, yes. They could carry food, spot predators, survive in the mosaic of forest and grassland, but they weren't us. Around 2.8 to 2.3 million years ago, something shifted. A new lineage emerged, a new kind of hominin with a brain that was noticeably larger, hands that were more dexterous, and a relationship with the environment that went beyond mere survival. This was the birth of the genus Homo, our genus, the lineage that would eventually produce you, me, and every person who has ever lived. Enter Homo habilis, handyman. The name is almost quaint, isn't it? But it captures something essential. This wasn't just another Australopithecine with a slightly different skull shape. Homo habilis had a brain that averaged around 600 cubic centimeters, substantially larger than Lucy's 400. That might not sound like much, but in evolutionary terms, it's a quantum leap. That extra grey matter meant more planning, more problem-solving, more capacity to imagine what wasn't yet real, and they used it. The Oldowan stone tools, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first discovered, represent a cognitive milestone. These weren't accidental sharp rocks. They were deliberately crafted implements, made by striking one stone against another at precise angles to create sharp flakes. Each tool required forethought, selecting the right type of stone, understanding how it would fracture, executing the strike with controlled force. It required teaching too. Someone had to show someone else. Knowledge had to be passed down. This is culture. Rudimentary perhaps, but culture nonetheless. Homo habilis still spent time in trees. Their arms were long, their fingers curved, adaptations for climbing. They lived in a world that was still transitioning, still caught between arboreal safety and terrestrial opportunity. But the trajectory was clear. The brain was growing. The hands were refining. The relationship with tools was deepening. And then came Homo erectus. Picture this. 1.9 million years ago, on the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya, a young boy dies. He's perhaps 8 or 9 years old, though his skeleton suggests he would have grown to nearly 6 feet tall. He's buried in sediment, and over the millennia, his bones fossilize. Fast forward to 1984. Paleontologist Kamoya Kimeo spots a small piece of skull eroding from a hillside. The excavation that follows uncovers something extraordinary, the most complete early hominin skeleton ever found. The Turkana boy. His skeleton tells a story that words alone cannot. Look at his proportions. They're essentially modern. Long legs, short arms, narrow hips. This wasn't a creature still hedging its bets between trees and ground. Homo erectus was fully committed to terrestrial life. These were walkers, runners, long-distance travelers. Their bodies were built for endurance, for covering vast territories under the African sun, and their brains, around 900 cubic centimeters, 50% larger than habilis. The skull of the Turkana boy shows all the hallmarks of what would become the human form: a flatter face, smaller teeth, a more rounded cranium. The evolutionary distance between habilis and erectus is striking, far more dramatic than the differences between erectus and us. Homo erectus represents a revolution. Consider what a larger brain demands. Grey matter is metabolically expensive. Your brain, right now, uses about 20% of your body's energy, despite being only 2% of your body weight. For erectus, with their growing brains, this created a paradox. How do you fuel a bigger brain when you're still foraging in an unpredictable environment? The answer changed everything. Fire and cooking. By 1.5 million years ago, we have evidence of controlled fire. Not just opportunistic use of natural wildfires, but deliberate ignition and maintenance. Hearths, burned bones, charred plant remains. The archaeological sites at Kubi Fora in Kenya and Swartkrans in South Africa preserve these ancient flames, frozen in time. Try to imagine the significance of this moment. Fire meant warmth on cold nights. It meant protection from predators. No lion willingly approaches a blaze. It meant light after sunset, extending the day, creating space for social interaction after the hunt. But most, crucially, fire meant cooking. Cooked food is pre-digested. The heat breaks down tough fibers, denatures proteins, kills parasites. Your body extracts far more calories from cooked meat and tubers than from raw. You spend less energy chewing, less energy digesting. And those saved calories? They can fuel a larger brain. Cooking and cognition became locked in a feedback loop, each enabling the expansion of the other. Fire also transformed social life. A hearth is a gathering place. Imagine those ancient groups sitting in a circle as darkness pressed in around them, flames dancing, faces illuminated. Stories could be told. Knowledge could be shared. Bonds could be strengthened. Fire created a center, a home base, a place of safety and community. And with larger brains, better tools, and the mastery of fire, Homo erectus did something no hominin had done before. They left Africa. Around 1.8 million years ago, small groups of Homo erectus walked out of the continent that had birthed them. They moved north, through the Sinai, into the Levant. They spread east into Georgia. The fossils at Dmanisi, dated to 1.8 million years ago, capture this moment. These are some of the most complete early Homo fossils found outside Africa, and they're strikingly primitive, showing that the migration happened early, when erectus was still evolving. From Georgia, the journey continued, into Central Asia, down into Southeast Asia, where Java man was discovered in the 1890s, across to China, where Peking man lived in caves near Beijing. By 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus had spread across much of the Old World. Why could they leave when earlier hominins could not? The answer lies in everything we've just discussed. Larger brains meant better planning, better problem-solving, better adaptation to new environments. Advanced tools, hand axes, cleavers, made it possible to process a wider variety of foods, to hunt more effectively. Fire provided warmth in colder climates, protection from unfamiliar predators, the ability to cook unfamiliar plants and make them edible, and cooperative hunting allowed small groups to take down large prey, securing the caloric resources needed to sustain their energy-hungry brains. Homo erectus wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. In Eurasia, they endured for over 1 million years. Let that sink in. Over 1 million years. Modern Homo sapiens has only existed for about 300,000 years. Homo erectus outlasted us by a factor of 3. They adapted to tropical rainforests in Java, temperate woodlands in China, seasonal grasslands in the Levant. They evolved into local variants, Java man, Peking man, populations shaped by their specific environments but all part of the erectus lineage. But here's what's fascinating. While erectus was spreading across Eurasia, evolution didn't stop in Africa. Back in the cradle, the evolutionary engine continued to churn. Around 700,000 to 600,000 years ago, a new hominin appears in the African fossil record Homo heidelbergensis. Named after a jaw found near Heidelberg, Germany, but likely originating in Africa, Heidelbergensis had an even larger brain, around 1,200 cubic centimeters, and more refined tools. The hand axes become more symmetrical, more carefully crafted, suggesting not just function, but perhaps aesthetic consideration. Heidelbergensis is crucial. This species, or something very much like it, appears to be the common ancestor of two of the most famous hominins in our family tree, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Around 600,000 to 400,000 years ago, the lineages began to diverge. Populations that migrated into Europe and Western Asia faced colder climates, ice ages, isolated valleys. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they evolved into Neanderthals, stocky, cold-adapted, with brains as large as ours but differently shaped. Meanwhile, back in Africa, other Heidelbergensis populations continued their own evolutionary trajectory, eventually giving rise to Homo sapiens. This split is visible in our DNA. Genetic studies show that Neanderthals and Denisovans, another archaic human population in Asia, separated from the sapiens lineage between 600,000 and 400,000 years ago. The molecular clock, ticking away in our genes, records the moment when our ancestors and theirs last shared a common population. But Africa during this period wasn't simple. It wasn't a single population neatly evolving into modern humans. The fossil record shows remarkable diversity. Multiple hominin species coexisted across the continent, some more archaic, some more modern, some representing evolutionary experiments that didn't lead to us. They overlapped in time and space. They competed for resources. And quite possibly, they interbred. This is the Pan-African model of human origins. For decades, the prevailing narrative was the Garden of Eden hypothesis, that modern humans evolved in a single, localized population somewhere in Africa, perhaps East Africa, perhaps Southern Africa, and then spread across the continent. But recent genetic and fossil evidence paints a more complex picture. Rather than a single origin point, Homo sapiens emerged from a network of interconnected populations spread across Africa. These populations weren't isolated. They traded genes, shared cultural innovations, occasionally merged and split as environmental conditions changed. Africa is vast, 3 times the size of Europe, with incredible environmental diversity. Rainforests in the Congo Basin, savannas in East Africa, deserts in the north, mountains, rivers, lakes. Each region shaped its inhabitants differently, but gene flow between populations prevented complete speciation. This diversity was Africa's strength. During this period, the Earth was experiencing intense climatic fluctuations. Ice ages came and went in cycles, each lasting tens of thousands of years. When ice sheets expanded in the northern hemisphere, Africa's climate shifted dramatically. Rainforests contracted, lakes dried up, deserts expanded. Populations became isolated in refugia, pockets of habitable land surrounded by harsh environments. And then the ice would retreat. Rainfall would return. Forests and grasslands would expand. Populations would reconnect. Genes would flow. Innovations would spread. This cycle of isolation and reconnection, repeated over hundreds of thousands of years, created an evolutionary pressure cooker. Isolated populations had to innovate to survive their local conditions. When they reconnected, the best innovations spread rapidly through cultural transmission. This process, called population structure and gene flow, may be the key to understanding why Africa remained the crucible of human evolution. Meanwhile, cultural innovation was accelerating. Stone tools became more sophisticated. The Acheulean hand axes of Homo erectus and Heidelbergensis were impressive, but by 300,000 years ago, a new technology emerged: the prepared core technique. Instead of simply striking flakes off a stone, tool makers began to carefully shape a core stone so that a single, perfect flake could be struck off. This required extraordinary spatial reasoning, the ability to visualize the final product before it existed. It required planning multiple steps ahead. This is abstract thinking. Language, too, was likely evolving during this period. We have no direct evidence. Words don't fossilize. But the complexity of tool-making, the coordination required for cooperative hunting, and the social structures implied by larger group sizes all suggest sophisticated communication. Perhaps not language as we know it, but something approaching it. Symbolic gestures, proto-words, the cognitive architecture that would eventually support full linguistic expression. By 400,000 years ago, the pieces were falling into place. Africa had maintained a diverse, interconnected network of hominin populations. These populations had large brains, sophisticated tools, controlled fire, and increasingly complex social structures. They lived in a continent that constantly challenged them with environmental shifts, forcing adaptation and innovation. And crucially, Africa's size and diversity meant that even when regional populations crashed due to drought or disease, others survived elsewhere on the continent, preserving the species and its accumulated knowledge. This is why Africa remained the crucible. Neanderthals in Europe were isolated in smaller populations, facing harsher climates with less genetic diversity. When environmental disasters struck, they had fewer refuges, fewer populations to draw on. Homo erectus in Asia had thrived for over 1 million years, but they, too, lived in smaller, more isolated groups, with less gene flow, less innovation exchange. Africa's genetic and environmental diversity maintained adaptability in a way no other region could match, and so the stage was set. For 300,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa, perhaps in multiple places across Africa, a new hominin appeared. A hominin with a high, rounded skull, a gracile skeleton, a prominent chin, a brain averaging 1350 cubic centimeters, capable of abstract thought, symbolic expression, and technological innovation, unlike anything the world had seen. Homo sapiens. We had arrived. Section 4. Homo sapiens, the African triumph and global journey. Around 315,000 years ago, in what is now Morocco, something unprecedented was happening. In a cave system called Jebel Irhoud, a group of hominins lived, hunted, and eventually died. Their bones would lie buried for over 300 millennia. When archaeologists finally unearthed them in the 1960s, and crucially, when they redated them using advanced techniques in 2017, the timeline of human origins shifted dramatically backward. These weren't just ancient humans. These were us, Homo sapiens, our species, walking, breathing, living in North Africa more than 300,000 years ago, and they weren't alone in being early. Thousands of miles to the southeast, along the Omo River in Ethiopia, more fossils tell a similar story. The Omo Kibish remains, dated to roughly 195,000 years ago, reveal the same anatomical signature: a skull with a high, rounded brain case, a face that pulls back beneath the forehead rather than jutting forward, the delicate bone structure we call gracile, slender, refined, distinctly modern. This is the birth of our species, not in one garden, not in one valley, but across the breadth of Africa, from the Mediterranean coast to the Ethiopian highlands. And the question becomes, what made these individuals different from everything that came before? Let's start with the obvious: the skeleton itself. If you could line up a Homo erectus, a Neanderthal, and a Homo sapiens side by side, the differences would be subtle but unmistakable. The sapiens skull sits high and domed, like a cathedral ceiling compared to the lower, elongated vaults of earlier species. The forehead rises almost vertically. There's a chin, a small bony protrusion at the base of the jaw that serves no obvious mechanical purpose but marks us unmistakably. The face is tucked in, retracted, giving us that flat profile we recognize in every human being alive today. The body, too, is lighter. The bones are thinner, less robust. Where Neanderthals had barrel chests and thick limb bones built for raw power and cold climates, sapiens had a more slender frame, optimized not for brute strength but for endurance, for covering long distances across varied terrain. We were built to walk, to run, to travel. And then there's the brain. Averaging around 1,850 cubic centimeters, the sapiens' brain isn't dramatically larger than a Neanderthal's. In fact, Neanderthals sometimes had slightly bigger brains. But size isn't everything. What mattered was organization, the wiring, the structure, the way different regions communicated. The high, rounded skull of sapiens suggests a differently shaped brain, one with expanded areas for abstract thinking, planning, and social cognition. The hardware was similar. The software, it seems, was revolutionary. But how do we know, really know, that all of us descend from these African populations? Enter genetics. In the 1980s and 90s, scientists began tracing human ancestry not through bones, but through genes. They focused on two particularly useful pieces of our genetic code: mitochondrial DNA, passed down exclusively through mothers, and Y chromosome DNA, passed exclusively through fathers. By comparing the genetic variation in modern populations and working backward, they could estimate when and where our most recent common ancestors lived. The results were stunning. All living humans trace their mitochondrial DNA back to a woman who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago, nicknamed Mitochondrial Eve. Not because she was the only woman alive, but because her mitochondrial lineage is the only one that survived to the present day. Similarly, all men trace their Y chromosomes back to Y chromosomal Adam, who lived around 200,000 years ago, also in Africa. These aren't literal individuals named Eve and Adam. They're statistical ancestors, the points where all modern lineages converge. But their existence tells us something profound. We all share African roots, every single one of us. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. When geneticists compare the DNA of modern populations, they find something extraordinary. African populations, particularly groups like the San people of southern Africa or the Hadza of Tanzania, have more genetic diversity than all non-African populations combined. Let that sink in for a moment. A single village in Africa can harbour more genetic variation than exists between a Norwegian and a Chinese person, or between an Australian Aboriginal and a Native American. What does this mean? It means Africa is the source, the wellspring. Everyone outside Africa descended from a small group of migrants, a genetic bottleneck that carried only a fraction of Africa's total diversity. Africa is the library. The rest of the world got a few books. This isn't speculation. This is written in our DNA, replicated in study after study, confirmed by every major genetic survey of human populations. Africa isn't just where we came from, it's why we're so diverse, and paradoxically, why non-Africans are so genetically similar. But here's the part that really challenges our assumptions about human history. Homo sapiens didn't just appear and immediately conquer the world. We stayed in Africa for over 200,000 years. Think about that timeline. Our species emerged around 300,000 years ago, give or take. But we didn't leave Africa in significant numbers until roughly 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. That's 250,000 years spent on the continent of our birth. A long, slow incubation period during which something crucial was developing, not our bodies, but our minds, our culture, our capacity for symbolic thought. The evidence is subtle but profound. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Pieces of ochre, a red mineral engraved with geometric patterns, cross-hatching, deliberate, repeated designs. These engravings date to around 100,000 years ago. They're not tools. They're not practical. They're symbolic, evidence of abstract thinking, of the desire to create meaning, to communicate through imagery. In the same cave, they found shell beads, tiny marine snail shells, deliberately perforated, strung together as jewelry or decoration. Again, around 100,000 years ago. These weren't for survival. They were for identity, for beauty, for signaling something about the wearer to others. They were culture made tangible. This is the cognitive revolution unfolding in slow motion. language, art, symbolism, ritual, all brewing in Africa while our species refined not just how we thought, but how we shared those thoughts with each other. And then, somewhere between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, small groups began to leave. The Great Migration, the exodus that would eventually populate every corner of the globe, wasn't a single event. It was a trickle, a few hundred individuals, maybe a few thousand, crossing out of Africa via the Sinai Peninsula, or perhaps along the southern coast of Arabia. These weren't explorers with a grand plan. They were people following game, seeking resources, adapting to new coastlines and environments. But that small trickle carried enormous consequences. Because of the bottleneck effect, the fact that only a tiny fraction of Africa's population left, non-African populations have far less genetic diversity. We're all descended from that small migrant group. Every European, every Asian, every indigenous Australian and American, our ancestors were part of that exodus. And because the group was small, we carried only a subset of the genetic variation that existed back in Africa. This is why genetic diversity decreases the farther you get from Africa. It's not about superiority or inferiority. It's about math, about founder effects and population genetics. And here's where the story gets wonderfully complicated. When those early sapiens migrants spread into Eurasia, they weren't entering an empty world. Other human species were already there. In Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals, descendants of Homo heidelbergensis who'd left Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier, had adapted to Ice Age conditions. Stocky, powerful, with large brains and sophisticated tools, they were formidable survivors. In Eastern Asia, another group lived in the shadows, the Denisovans, known primarily from DNA extracted from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave. We still don't know much about what they looked like, but genetically they were distinct, a sister species to Neanderthals. And when sapiens met these relatives, something unexpected happened. They interbred. Genetic studies of modern humans reveal that non-Africans carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. If you're of European or Asian descent, you have Neanderthal ancestors. Some populations in Oceania and Asia also carry Denisovan DNA, evidence of interbreeding events in the deep past. This complicates the narrative, doesn't it? We didn't simply replace our relatives. We absorbed them. We loved them, or at least mated with them, and their genes became part of us. But, and this is crucial, the vast majority of our genome remains purely sapiens, purely African. Those Neanderthal and Denisovan contributions are real, but they're traces, whispers, echoes. The core of who we are, genetically, is African Homo sapiens. The interbreeding didn't change that fundamental truth. It added complexity, yes, but it didn't rewrite the story. And sapiens didn't stop at Eurasia. The spread was astonishingly rapid once it began. By 40,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, a journey that required seafaring, planning, and courage. By 15,000 years ago, we'd crossed into the Americas, populating 2 entirely new continents. Within roughly 50,000 years, a species that had spent 250,000 years in Africa had become global. Which raises the obvious question: why did sapiens succeed where others failed? Neanderthals had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus had survived in Asia for over 1 million years. Both were intelligent, adaptable, and tough. So why did they go extinct while we thrived? One compelling answer is what scientists call the Pan-African Innovation Network theory. Africa is huge. It's the second largest continent, with an extraordinary range of environments: rainforests, savannas, deserts, mountains, coastlines. And crucially, it's where the largest Homo sapiens population lived. More people means more brains. More brains means more innovation. More innovation means better tools, better strategies, better adaptations. But it's not just about numbers, it's about connection. African populations, despite being spread across a massive continent, remained in contact. Trade networks, migration, intermarriage, All of this created a web of cultural exchange. Ideas could flow. A tool innovation in southern Africa could eventually reach populations in the north. A hunting strategy developed in the east could spread west. Neanderthals, by contrast, lived in smaller, more isolated populations. Europe during the Ice Age was a fragmented landscape of refuges separated by ice sheets and harsh terrain. Population sizes were smaller, genetic diversity was lower, and crucially, the flow of innovation was slower. It's not that Neanderthals weren't smart, they absolutely were. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, cared for their sick, buried their dead. But they lacked the critical mass of interconnected populations that sapiens had. Cooperation and culture became our secret weapons. Sapiens developed complex social networks that enabled rapid adaptation and knowledge transfer. We didn't just learn from our own experiences, we learned from each other, across generations, across vast distances. We built on accumulated knowledge in ways that accelerated innovation exponentially. And we had language. Not simple communication. Animals have that. But complex recursive language capable of expressing abstract concepts, hypothetical scenarios, shared mythologies. Language allowed us to coordinate in large groups, to plan for the future, to teach intricate skills. It was the ultimate cognitive edge, refined over tens of thousands of years in Africa. By the time sapiens left Africa, we weren't just anatomically modern, we were cognitively modern, culturally modern, and that made all the difference. Now, it's worth pausing here to address some complications in the narrative, because science is never as clean as we'd like. In 2019, researchers announced the discovery of Danuvius guggenmosi, an 11.6 million-year-old ape found in Germany. Analysis of its bones suggested it might have been bipedal, or at least capable of upright walking. If true, this would mean bipedalism evolved outside Africa, long before our African ancestors stood up. Does this upend everything? Not really. It complicates, but doesn't contradict. Bipedalism may have evolved multiple times in different lineages. Danuvius, if it was indeed bipedal, represents a European ape experiment that eventually went extinct. It's not our ancestor. The bipedalism that led to humans still evolved in Africa, in our lineage, under the specific environmental pressures we've discussed. Convergent evolution, where similar traits evolve independently, is common in nature. And here's another complication. Homo erectus lived in Eurasia for over 1 million years. Why didn't they become human in the modern sense? The answer is, they did evolve, just not into us. Homo erectus populations in Europe likely contributed to the Neanderthal lineage. Populations in Asia may have given rise to Denisovans and other archaic humans. They didn't stay static. They adapted, changed, evolved into new forms suited to their environments, but they didn't become Homo sapiens. That happened in Africa, along a different evolutionary path, under different pressures. And this brings us back to the power of Africa's environment. Constant climatic variability, oscillating between wet and dry periods, forests expanding and contracting, savannas appearing and disappearing. This wasn't a stable paradise, it was a pressure cooker. Populations had to adapt constantly, had to innovate or die. And crucially, Africa's size meant that even during harsh periods, refugees existed. Populations could contract, survive, and then expand again when conditions improved. This cycle of pressure and refuge, repeated over hundreds of thousands of years, forged a species capable of adapting to almost anything. Genetic studies continue to confirm this African origin, no matter how much complexity we uncover. Every new genome sequenced, every ancient DNA sample analyzed, every population study conducted, all roads lead back to Africa. The details get more intricate, the timelines get refined, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. We are an African species, and this has profound implications for how we see ourselves today. We are one species, one family, with one recent shared origin. The concept of biological races, distinct subspecies of humans, simply doesn't hold up under genetic scrutiny. We're too young as a species, too interconnected. The genetic variation within any given population is greater than the average difference between populations. The physical differences we see, skin color, hair texture, facial features, are superficial adaptations to local environments controlled by a tiny fraction of our genes. Beneath those cosmetic differences, our shared humanity is profound and undeniable. If you're of European descent, your ancestors left Africa roughly 50,000 years ago. If you're of East Asian descent, maybe 60,000 years ago. If you're indigenous Australian, perhaps 65,000 years ago. These are eye blinks in evolutionary time. We're all Africans who've been away from home for a little while, and there are lessons in this for our present moment. Africa's diversity, genetic, cultural, environmental, fostered our success as a species. Diversity wasn't a weakness to be overcome. It was the engine of innovation, the source of our adaptability. When we celebrate diversity today, we're not being politically correct. We're honoring the very thing that made us human. Our ancestors survived multiple ice ages, dramatic climate shifts, and environmental catastrophes through cooperation and cultural knowledge sharing. As we face our own climate crisis, that lesson resonates. We solved existential challenges before by working together, by sharing solutions across populations, by adapting collectively. We have the evolutionary toolkit. We just need to remember how to use it. And here's something that often gets overlooked. Human evolution hasn't stopped. We're still adapting, still changing. High-altitude populations in Tibet have evolved genetic adaptations to low oxygen within the last few thousand years. Some populations have evolved lactose tolerance in adulthood, a trait that didn't exist 10,000 years ago. We're still responding to our environments, still evolving in real time. The story isn't over. We're living chapters in an ongoing saga that began in Africa millions of years ago. So, when we ask, why did we evolve only in Africa? The answer isn't just about geography or climate or chance. It's about a perfect confluence of factors that created the conditions for something extraordinary. The Rift Valley's geological activity, the climatic variability that demanded flexibility, the size and diversity of the continent that allowed experimentation and exchange, the refuges that prevented extinction during harsh periods. Africa isn't just where we came from, it's why we succeeded. Every language spoken today, from Mandarin to English, from Swahili to Spanish, traces its roots back to African tongues. Every cultural achievement, every technological innovation, every artistic tradition, every philosophical insight, all of it rests on foundations laid in Africa over hundreds of thousands of years. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built in Africa. The Renaissance in Europe, created by descendants of African migrants. The Taj Mahal in India, the Great Wall of China, the civilizations of the Americas, all built by hands that carried African DNA, minds shaped by African evolution. When you look at another human being, regardless of where they're from or what they look like, you're looking at a relative, a cousin separated by at most 2,000 or 3,000 generations. In the grand sweep of evolutionary time, we all left the family reunion about 5 minutes ago. This perspective doesn't erase the rich diversity of human cultures. It doesn't diminish the unique beauty of different traditions and ways of life. Instead, it adds a deeper layer of meaning. We're one family that has diversified spectacularly, adapted brilliantly, and created countless variations on what it means to be human, all while remaining fundamentally, genetically, undeniably connected. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps that's the thought to carry with you. You are the product of millions of years of African innovation. Your ability to think, to speak, to imagine, to dream, these were forged in the Rift Valley, refined on the African savannas, perfected over countless generations before your ancestors ever left the continent. You are, in the most literal sense, a child of Africa. We all are, and that shared heritage, that common origin, that undeniable biological unity, it's not just a scientific fact, it's an invitation to see each other as family, to recognize that our differences are recent, superficial, and beautiful, while our similarities are ancient, profound, and fundamental. Africa gave us everything: the upright posture that freed our hands, the big brains that let us wonder, the language that let us share those wonders, the social bonds that let us survive, the creativity that let us thrive, the resilience that carried us through ice ages and droughts and every challenge the world could throw at us. Every step you take, you walk on feet shaped in Africa. Every thought you think with a brain designed in Africa. Every word you speak with a voice that echoes African origins. We didn't just evolve in Africa, we became human there, and no matter how far we've wandered, no matter how long we've been away, we carry that African legacy in every cell, every gene, every beat of our hearts. That's not just history, that's who we are. Section 6. Conclusion and Reflection. The African Legacy and Our Shared Future. So here we are. After wandering through 66 million years of evolutionary history, after tracing the path from tiny, shrew-like survivors of an asteroid apocalypse to the 7 billion humans now scattered across every continent and island on Earth, we arrive at an answer. Why did we evolve only in Africa? The question itself feels almost too big to hold in your mind. It encompasses geology and genetics, climate and chance, isolation and innovation. But if we pull back and look at the entire journey we've taken together, a pattern emerges. Not a simple pattern, evolution never offers simple answers, but a comprehensible one. A story written in stone and bone and DNA. Africa was different, not superior, not predetermined by destiny or divine plan. Just different. In ways that mattered profoundly for the particular path evolution would take. Let's trace it one more time, slowly, letting the pieces settle into place. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of 1 billion nuclear weapons. The dinosaurs died. The world burned, then froze, then slowly, painfully, came back to life. In the wreckage, our ancestors, tiny primates no larger than rats, survived in the trees. They were nobody special. Just lucky, just adaptable enough to make it through. Over the next 40 million years, those primates evolved. Forward-facing eyes for depth perception, grasping hands for navigating branches, larger brains for processing the three-dimensional maze of the forest canopy. And here's the twist we explored early on. The higher primates, the anthropoids, first evolved in Asia, not Africa. Our distant ancestors migrated to Africa from the east, finding refuge in its equatorial forests, while their Asian cousins gradually went extinct under the pressure of cooling climates and changing landscapes. Africa became the sanctuary, the place where primates could diversify, experiment, survive. And then, between 10 and 7 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. The East African Rift System, that massive geological wound tearing the continent apart, created a patchwork of environments. Dense forests here, open grasslands there, volcanic highlands, freshwater lakes, a mosaic of microclimates packed into a relatively small area. This wasn't happening anywhere else. Not like this. Not with this intensity, this diversity, this combination of stability and change. And in that mosaic, some apes started to stand up. Bipedalism. Walking upright on 2 legs. It seems so fundamental to being human that we forget how strange it is, how rare, how revolutionary. Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, Ardipithecus, the Australopithecines. Over millions of years, different lineages experimented with this new way of moving. Some succeeded, most didn't. But the ones that did gained something precious: efficiency. The ability to cover long distances without exhausting themselves. The ability to carry things, food, tools, infants, across fragmented landscapes. The ability to see farther, move smarter, adapt faster. Bipedalism freed the hands, and freed hands could manipulate the world in ways no other ape had dreamed of. But here's what matters. This happened in Africa because only Africa had the right conditions. The mosaic environments that rewarded versatility, the rift valleys that created isolated populations, allowing experimentation, the equatorial position that provided climatic refuge even as ice ages gripped the higher latitudes. Other continents had forests, other continents had grasslands, but only Africa had this specific perfect storm of geological and climatic factors converging at exactly the right time. Then came Homo, our genus, the toolmakers, the fire-wielders, the thinkers. Around 2 million years ago, brains started getting bigger, not just a little bigger, dramatically bigger. Homo habilis with their Oldowan stone tools, Homo erectus with their sophisticated hand axes, their controlled use of fire, their ability to hunt cooperatively and plan ahead. These weren't just physical changes, they were cognitive revolutions. The expansion of the prefrontal cortex, the development of language, the capacity for abstract thought, for imagining futures that didn't yet exist, and then working together to bring them into being. And yes, Homo erectus left Africa. Around 1.8 million years ago, they walked out into Eurasia and thrived there for over 1 million years. They were successful, adaptable, resilient. They evolved into Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia. But here's the crucial point. Back in Africa, evolution didn't stop. The continent's diversity, its size, its range of environments, its interconnected populations, created what researchers call a Pan-African innovation network. Ideas, genes, technologies could flow between groups. Populations could separate, experiment, then reconnect and share their innovations. Africa was an evolutionary laboratory on a continental scale, and 300,000 years ago, that laboratory produced us, Homo sapiens, with our gracile skeletons, our high foreheads, our prominent chins, with brains averaging 1,350 cubic centimeters, not dramatically larger than Neanderthals but organized differently, wired for language, for symbolism, for culture in ways that would prove transformative. For 200,000 years, we stayed in Africa. We weren't stuck there. We chose to stay, or rather, there was no evolutionary pressure strong enough to drive us out. We had everything we needed. And during that long incubation period, we developed something extraordinary. Complex culture, abstract art, symbolic thinking, the ability to transmit knowledge not just through genes but through teaching, through story, through accumulated wisdom passed from generation to generation. When we finally did leave Africa around 70 to 50,000 years ago, we carried that cultural toolkit with us, and it made all the difference. Within 30,000 years, we had spread to every inhabitable continent. We encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans, and, in most cases, absorbed them. A little interbreeding here and there, 1 to 4% of non-African genomes carry Neanderthal DNA, but the vast majority of who we are, genetically and cognitively, is purely sapiens, purely African. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down through mothers, traces back to Africa around 150,000 years ago. Y chromosomal DNA, passed down through fathers, points to the same place, roughly the same time. And here's the kicker. Modern African populations contain more genetic diversity than all non-African populations combined. What does that mean? It means everyone outside Africa descended from a small migrant group, perhaps just a few thousand individuals, while Africa retained the full spectrum of human genetic variation. We are all African, not metaphorically, literally, genetically, undeniably. Every person alive today, regardless of where they were born, what language they speak, what they look like, every single one of us can trace our ancestry back to Africa within the last 100,000 years. That's recent. In evolutionary terms, that's yesterday. We are one species, one family, with one recent shared origin. And this matters. God, does it matter? Because in an age of division, of tribalism, of arbitrary lines drawn between us and them, our African origin stands as an irrefutable reminder. There is no them, there is only us. The biological concept of race, the idea that humanity can be divided into discrete, meaningful categories based on superficial physical traits, is scientifically bankrupt. It's a social construct, not a biological reality. The genetic differences between a Kenyan and a Norwegian are trivial compared to the genetic differences within African populations themselves. We are too young as a species to have diverged meaningfully, too interconnected, too recently emerged from our shared cradle. This isn't just abstract science, this is personal. The story we've traced through deep time, from asteroid survivors to bipedal apes to globe-spanning civilization, this is your story. Your ancestors stood upright in the East African rift. Your ancestors chipped the first stone tools. Your ancestors painted ochre on cave walls and told stories around fires and looked up at the stars and wondered. Every innovation, every adaptation, every hard-won survival, you carry that legacy in your cells, in the structure of your skeleton, optimized for bipedal walking, in the wiring of your brain, shaped by millions of years of social cooperation, in your DNA, which still bears the signature of Africa in every chromosome. And Africa itself, the cradle of humanity, isn't just a historical footnote, it's a living, dynamic continent of immense innovation, resilience, and cultural wealth. The same diversity that fostered our evolution, the genetic, linguistic, ecological richness, continues today. Africa is home to over 3,000 distinct ethnic groups, speaking more than 2,000 languages. It's a continent of megacities and ancient traditions, cutting-edge technology, and deep ecological knowledge. To think of Africa only as our past is to miss half the story. It's our present and our future too. The lessons embedded in our evolutionary journey feel urgent right now. Our ancestors survived dramatic climate shifts, ice ages, droughts, environmental upheavals that would have destroyed less adaptable species. How did they do it? Through cooperation, through cultural knowledge sharing, through diversity, genetic and behavioral, that allowed different groups to experiment with different survival strategies. We face our own climate crisis now, our own environmental upheavals, and the evolutionary toolkit that carried our ancestors through their challenges is still available to us. We have the capacity for cooperation on a global scale. We have the cognitive flexibility to innovate, to adapt, to change course when the old ways stop working. We have diversity, cultural, intellectual, genetic, that represents not a source of conflict, but a reservoir of solutions. The question is whether we'll use these gifts, whether we'll remember that we're all branches of the same African tree. Environmental stewardship matters in this context. The ecosystems that created us, the rift valleys, the forests, the grasslands, shaped our bodies and minds over millions of years. We are products of Earth's biodiversity. And now, in a geological eye blink, we've become powerful enough to destroy that biodiversity, to simplify ecosystems, to drive species extinct at rates not seen since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. There's a circularity here, a poetic justice or injustice depending on how we act. The diversity of life on Earth made us possible. What we do with that inheritance will determine what becomes possible for the species and ecosystems that come after us. But let's zoom out even further. Let's appreciate the sheer improbability, the staggering wonder of it all. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck the Earth. If it had hit a few moments earlier or later, landing in deep ocean instead of shallow sea, the impact would have been less catastrophic. The dinosaurs might have survived. Mammals might have remained small, nocturnal, marginal. Everything that followed, primates, apes, humans, might never have happened. But it did hit, and mammals did survive, and over unimaginable stretches of time, through countless generations, through extinctions and radiations and migrations and adaptations, a lineage emerged that could look back on its own history and ask, why? on one continent, against cosmic odds. Consciousness emerged. Self-awareness. The ability to contemplate the universe and our place in it, to create art and music and mathematics, to love, to grieve, to wonder. That's what Africa gave us. Not just bodies adapted for walking upright, not just brains capable of language, but the gift of being human in the fullest sense, connected to each other, to our history, to the living world that made us. So what comes next? Our evolution hasn't stopped. We're still changing, still adapting, though now cultural evolution far outpaces genetic change. The selection pressures we face are different: disease, technology, social complexity. But evolution continues. What will we become in another 100,000 years? Another million? Will we still recognize ourselves? Will we still remember Africa? These are open questions. The future is unwritten, but the past, the past is clear. Carved in fossils, encoded in genes, preserved in volcanic ash and ancient stone tools, we came from Africa, all of us, every single one of us. As you drift off tonight, imagine that long chain of ancestors stretching back through time. Thousands of generations, millions of years. Each one survived long enough to reproduce, to pass their genes forward, to contribute to the unbroken thread that eventually became you. The odds against your existence are astronomical. And yet, here you are, the product of an evolutionary journey that began in African forests and savannas, that was shaped by rift valleys and climate swings, that was refined through cooperation and innovation. Picture the African savanna at dusk, the sky turning orange and purple, acacia trees in silhouette. Somewhere in the distance, a group of early humans, your ancestors, walking upright across the grassland, carrying tools, caring for their young. They don't know they're making history. They're just trying to survive, to find food, to make it to tomorrow. But their footprints will last 3.6 million years, preserved in volcanic ash at Latoli. And their descendants will inherit the earth. You are the product of millions of years of African innovation, of geological accidents and climatic pressures and the sheer tenacity of life. You carry that continent in your bones, in your DNA, in the structure of your mind. Never forget that. If you can, explore your own ancestry. Trace your family tree back as far as records allow, and then imagine it continuing back through the mists of time, through the development of writing and agriculture, through the migration out of Africa, through the long incubation period of sapiens, back and back to the first bipedal ape standing upright in the Rift Valley. If you have the opportunity, visit Africa. Walk where your ancestors walked. Feel the connection and honor the cradle. Support conservation efforts. Oppose the forces of division that try to convince us we're separate species instead of one family. Celebrate diversity as the evolutionary advantage it is. If you've enjoyed this journey through deep time, consider subscribing. There are more stories to tell, more deep dives into history, into science, into the grand narrative of how we got here. Check out the playlist for other evolution content, other episodes designed to help you drift off while contemplating the wonders of the universe and our place in it. This script draws on decades of paleoanthropological research, genetic studies, archaeological discoveries, the work of countless scientists excavating fossils in the East African Rift, analyzing ancient DNA, piecing together the puzzle of human origins. Their work gives us this story, our story. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for spending these hours wandering through 66 million years of history, for being curious about where we came from and why it matters. Here's the closing thought, the one to carry with you into sleep. We all began in Africa. Every language, every culture, every achievement of human civilization traces back to that one continent. We all carry its gift, the gift of bipedalism, of big brains, of cooperation and culture. We are all African. The differences we see, skin color, facial features, the thousand variations of human appearance are recent adaptations to local environments, cosmetic changes painted over a fundamentally identical blueprint. Beneath those superficial differences, we are one people, one species, one family. That's not a political statement, it's a scientific fact. And in a world that seems determined to divide us, to draw lines and build walls and insist on difference, maybe that fact is the most important thing we can remember. Rest now. Let the gentle music carry you. Imagine the wind blowing across ancient African plains, carrying the scent of grass and rain. Imagine your ancestors, all of our ancestors, looking up at the same stars we see tonight, wondering the same questions we still ask. We are the universe become conscious of itself. We are Africa's gift to the world. And that story, that incredible, improbable, beautiful story continues in you. Sleep well. Sleep.